Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Executive Actions and Their Impact on Charitable Nonprofits. We will get started shortly. We want to make sure that as many people join the line before we officially kick off today's webinar. Thank you for joining. We have received a lot of interest in this webinar. I think so far we have at least 10,000 people who registered to receive a recording and nearly 10,000 who are joining us live, which means that there is a lot of interest, a lot of questions, and we will answer as many of the questions as possible during the presentation. So as we get ready to begin, just a few housekeeping items. This call is being recorded and we will make the recording available through our YouTube channel. Everyone is in listen-only mode, so you cannot unmute yourself. You will only hear the panelists during the presentation. We do have live captioning available. At the bottom of your screen, you will see the show captions option to be able to have access to those. And we also have American Sign Language interpretation available. And so just to reiterate that, there were a lot of questions that were submitted during the registration process, and that's great to know the range of topics that people want information on. And we are going to cover as many of this as possible, not just during the presentation, but in the Q&A section. So we understand that not everyone's question will be answered, but we hope that everyone walks away with a little bit more concrete information. And once again, a recording of this webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel, and all registrants will receive an email tomorrow with a link. And with that, I think we can officially turn to the agenda for today's presentation. So first, you'll hear an overview of the executive orders that have been signed since January 20th. And then we'll get into the state perspective. What are people hearing? What are people experiencing? And then we'll get into the overview of the lawsuit. So to talk about the executive orders, you'll hear from Tiffany Gourley Policy Counsel at the National Council of Nonprofits. Nonoko Sato, the presidency of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, will give the state perspective. And Jessica Morton, Senior Counsel at Democracy Forward, will share the overview of the lawsuit. And before we get into the bulk of the presentation, we'll have some opening remarks from Diane Yentel, the presidency of the National Council of Nonprofits. I think I see her now. So yes, I will turn it over to you, Diane.
Okay, thanks so much, Jessica, and thank you to everyone who's joined today. We've had a tremendous response to this webinar. We have over about 10,000 people that registered to be here live and another 10,000 that registered to hear the recording. So we're so glad to have such a strong response and participation. So thank you for joining. I'm Diane Yentel. I'm President and CEO of the National Council of Nonprofits. National Council of Nonprofits is a nonpartisan organization. We are the largest network of nonprofits in North America. We champion, inform, and connect organizations across the country to protect and advance the sector, to support nonprofit organizations in maintaining and expanding the essential work you do every day in all our communities. And our closest, our most essential partners in this work is our network of state associations of nonprofits. So if you're not yet familiar with or a member of your state association of nonprofits, please go ahead and join them right away. You can find a list of them on our website, or you can reach out to us to get connected. Through joining your state association of nonprofits, you'll also become a member of the National Council of Nonprofits. And together, this is how you can receive the most up-to-date real-time information on what's happening in DC, how that impacts what's happening in your state, and how you can prepare and get involved in the work to protect and advance the sector. And your work and your engagement is truly more important now than ever. As we're already seeing very clearly, 2025 will be a tremendously consequential year for the nonprofit sector, with executive orders and actions that are attempting to dismantle funding for the essential work of nonprofits, with tax reform and potential budget cuts that could further reduce needed funding, with potential threats to nonprofit nonpartisanship, and with existential threats to the entire nonprofit sector itself, really direct targeting of and aiming to harm civil society. Put simply, there isn't a way for the nonprofit sector to end 2025 in a neutral place. There's really no ending this year, more or less where we started. We'll either end this year on a spectrum of harm, somewhere from somewhat harmed to potentially decimated, or we'll end it strengthened. And not just in spite of, but because of these challenges we face. If we do this right, we can, as a sector, be strengthened through new partnerships and collaborations, expanded coalitions, through robust and clear communications to shore up support for nonprofits. We'll be strengthened with sophisticated and new legal strategies. And we'll be strengthened, most of all, by uniting as a sector to respond to and defeat these threats. The administration's actions and rhetoric so far that we have seen are targeting civil society writ large. To be successful, our response has to be equal to their efforts in strength, collaboration, sophistication, and coordination. At the National Council of Nonprofits, we are, as I know you are too, deeply concerned about what's happening in this moment. We're concerned by the many executive orders the president has signed that would have a harmful impact on the nonprofit sector and the people and the communities that we serve. We're deeply concerned about the associated actions that the president and his administration have taken, some sweeping and reckless, like the OMB directive issued last week to attempt to shut down virtually all federal spending. And we're concerned too about the tactics to repress activity, repress action, and the chilling effect that this can have on nonprofits working, especially those working with some of the most marginalized and vulnerable to harm people. So just as these threats to the nonprofit sector are new in their scope and their severity, we in the nonprofit field must work together in new and expanded ways, build and bolster partnerships, tell the story and the incredible impact of nonprofit organizations in new and more highly visible ways, build public support. We'll need to litigate, advocate, communicate, and do it all coordinated, considered, and effectively. As an example of acting in new ways, last week, the National Council of Nonprofit filed suit against the Office of Management and Budget to stop its reckless action to halt nearly all federal funding. And we had a big and early win, a very meaningful halt, or at least a pause, to an action that would have had catastrophic consequences for the nonprofit sector and the people in the communities they serve. And we were successful in part because of our fantastic attorneys at Democracy Forward, one of whom you'll hear from soon. And we still are successful because of you, because of this incredible network, because of an outpouring of assistance and support, leadership, information from all of you. And this is what we need in this moment, this kind of quick response by so many of you on this call to share impacts, all while continuing your essential work. This is what we'll need and what we'll continue to need. So many thanks for that. And special thanks to those of you who are engaging in this way or with NCN for the first time in the past few weeks. We're so glad to have you and we welcome you. Our litigation is still active and the issue is still very much in play. We know that while the temporary restraining order worked and many funding streams that were previously closed are now open, we also know that still many of you are not receiving funding and are having to make impossible decisions about what to do with dwindling or no funding. And I know that the onslaught of information and threats and attacks on your work is taking a toll. I know that you have endless, valid, important questions, many of which we won't be able to cover on a 60-minute webinar today. So while we'll do our best to share as much relevant to you right now information on this webinar today, we'll also, in the days and weeks and months to come, we'll be sharing more information, FAQs, fact sheets, deeper analysis of all the threats and challenges and the ways that you can consider preparing and responding. So while we won't get to all of your questions today, we literally had hundreds and hundreds submitted. Remember that today is the beginning, not the end of a conversation, right? And it's the beginning of a new way of working together, the beginning of broader partnerships, of a more unified sector, and it's the beginning of the end of an ability for this administration or anyone to divide or harm the nonprofit sector. So many thanks again to all of you for all of your essential work in your communities and your engagement and your advocacy. And thank you again for joining us today. I'll turn it back to Jessica.
Thank you, Diane. And so now we'll turn things over to Tiffany Gourley-Carter, Policy Counsel at the National Council of Nonprofits, to talk about the executive orders. Thanks, Tiffany.
Thanks, Jessica, and thank you, Diane, for that great start to this webinar. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the executive orders and kind of the administrative actions that have taken place since President Trump was inaugurated. So next slide. What is an executive order? We thought we would start here. We're getting this question a lot. What is an executive order? The basics of it is every president has the ability to sign executive orders. It's the power of the pen. Every president since President Washington has done this. And it's kind of their way of, setting up the government, putting their mark on policy, directing where they want to go with their administration. It's normally the very first thing that presidents do as soon as they take this oath of office. So this was extremely normal. They often will repeal or rescind something, a previous executive order. That's also very, very common. Executive orders have the power and force of law. They're not legislation. So it's actually the president's way of bypassing Congress. They don't need to be approved by Congress. It's just what the president wants to say with his power as the executive. So this is extremely common. What we saw, though, on inauguration night with President Trump is kind of a huge amount of executive orders that I don't think anyone was really prepared for. But he did say that he was going to do this. What was really surprising, besides just the number, is kind of the breadth of topics that were covered by the executive orders that he signed as well. So he did sign over 50 right off the bat. We're up to about 70 to 80 already in this for a couple weeks, and they keep coming. So I actually had to update these slides just minutes before this because more things happen. So executive orders and administrative actions are being taken place. What we did, though, is we immediately created a chart of the various executive orders that we saw that were either directly or indirectly affecting nonprofits and the work that we're seeing on the ground. So this is really common for presidents to kind of their mark on what they really want to focus on. But what we didn't know was kind of this breadth of topics. So these are the ones that we broke down, the categories that we saw: diversity, equity, inclusion, the federal government, immigration, LGBTQ plus rights, environmental, and kind of this civic community engagement with the census, and then kind of this, other topics that were, indirectly affected by the various executive orders. Next slide. So I wanted to go into a few that I've heard recently from various nonprofits really interested in a couple of these and what they say. So in the diversity, equity, and inclusion bucket, what was done under the Ending Illegal Discrimination and Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity executive order, this was one of the first ones that was signed. It required that the federal government would review all of their policies and their processes and directives and guidance that dealt with DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it was requiring the Attorney General to take appropriate action to advance anti-DE&I in the private sector. So how this affects nonprofits is often nonprofits are the ones working in this space, providing these types of trainings, being government contractors that are doing this kinds of trainings. And so we're seeing that this specific order is affecting nonprofits. Next slide. What came out though is, a couple then memos have also been issued that affect these various executive orders as well. And so we're also seeing how those memos then affect the work being done by nonprofits. Something else that this executive order did or does is it rescinds an old executive order. So remember I mentioned that only presidents have the power to rescind or revoke previous orders. This is one that was from 1964. And so this specific new executive order rescinded an old one. And the old one actually required non-discrimination provisions and affirmative action in government contracts. So nonprofits with government contracts are starting to see this play out. This was also the first executive order that we saw that directly cited nonprofits in the executive order itself. It had a provision or has a provision that requires each agency, we don't know how many agencies, to identify up to 9 potential investigations. So each agency can identify up to 9 of publicly traded corporations, specifically for our purposes, large nonprofit corporations or associations. We don't know what large means, that's undefined. Foundations with assets of $500 million or more. And then also institutions of higher education with endowments over $1 billion. So these are specific provisions that affect nonprofits that we saw come out of this first grouping of executive orders affecting diversity, equity, and inclusion. Next slide. The next one, so I was mentioning the memos. So there are a couple of memos that have come out in the last couple days and weeks that would also require the various government agencies to start eliminating staff, programs, references, and actually start investigating groups that are working in this DE&I space. Next slide. There's a second diversity, equity, and inclusion executive order ending radical and wasteful government DE&I programs and preferences. This one directs Office of Management and Budget and Office of Personnel Management. Sorry for all of the alphabet soup, but it would direct these agencies that kind of oversee the functioning and the work of nonprofit or of government and their personnel to terminate all DE&I programs. So between these two different diversity, equity, and inclusion executive orders, it's kind of all encompassing of removing these different programs and personnel working in it for the federal government specifically. Next slide. Speaking of the federal government, so as I said, executive orders often work on kind of the function of the federal government and what the administration wants to accomplish with them. So this administration has made it very clear that they want to shrink the federal workforce. They're doing this through offering buyouts to current federal workers. They're doing a hiring freeze and closing a couple of different agencies, and then also they've established what's called the Department of Government Efficiency as well to come in and start making changes to the various administrative, the various federal agencies. And we're seeing this play out in real time. And there's been a lot of changes because of this that are happening very, very quickly. And we expect that to continue for the foreseeable future. Next slide. The next area, so this was the area that we expected President Trump to really want to make a mark on, is immigration and security, border security, and how he wanted to address the border specifically. He put out one big immigration executive order calling for the protecting the American people against invasion. There's a lot of immigration policy in this area, and it really does affect a lot of nonprofits that are working in immigration, refugee settlements, resettling, and working with undocumented immigrants And so we're seeing that play out as well. There's a lot of memos coming out of the Department of Justice, and then also Office of Personnel Management and Office of Budget Management that address the immigration space. Next slide. One more area is what qualifies as citizenship. There is another one that is challenging birthright citizenship under the US Constitution. This means that if a person is born to a mother who is either unlawfully in the US or here lawfully but temporarily, and the father is not a US citizen or a permanent resident, then the question is whether that person would be considered a US citizen for being born in the US. This specific executive order has been challenged in at least 2 different federal jurisdictions and have been blocked as of right now in Maryland and Washington State, and it applies nationally. So we expect this one to continue to go through the courts as well. But as of right now, this one is blocked. Next slide. LGBTQ plus space, you know, the big one that came out here is having the US recognize only 2 sexes, male and female. This would affect government issued identification, things like passports, and driver's license. You could only have an identification of either being male or female. There's also additional executive orders that deal with this, you know, trans rights and things in things like sports. And these ones are continuing to come out. Next slide. There's many on the environment. President Trump has addressed things like FEMA. He continues to bring this up in the news. Revoking the implementation of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This had a lot of funding for different environmental projects, specifically through the Environmental Protection Agency. And then terminating the Green New Deal, which I know affects a lot of nonprofits in the environmental space. Next slide. Finally, civic engagement. This is a big topic on back to, we were talking about citizenship. There was an executive order under the Biden administration that required all persons to be counted in the census, regardless of citizenship and immigration status. This was actually a leftover issue that had come from the first President Trump administration. And under the US Constitution, the census counts all persons regardless of citizenship or immigration status. So this rescinded a previous executive order that required this full count. And so we expect this one to go into the courts as well. And then there's also another one that is dealing with voting and access to voting as well. So once again, I said there's a huge breadth of topics that have been covered in this, and we expect more to keep coming. Next slide. To that point, one just came out minutes before this this webinar went live. This was actually a memo, not an executive order, but it is addressing non-governmental organizations. This is a pretty broad topic of non-governmental organizations. And it is specifically from the White House requiring all agencies to align agencies' future funding decisions with the interest of the United States and with the goals and priorities of the administration. As I said, this just came out. We had to update these slides to include this in it, and we're not quite sure what this means yet. So we're continuing to dig into it and find out where the intent is behind this specific memo that came out. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of questions. We don't know what the answers are to a lot of them, but there is a big breadth of topics that we know directly affect the organizations that are on this call. So thank you for joining us. And we're continuing to update our chart that has all this information on it pretty much daily. So keep an eye on that. So with that, I turn it back over to Jessica.
Thanks, Tiffany, for that overview and even the breaking news. There's a lot happening, and we know that a lot of these decisions have ripple effects. So we'll now turn it over to Nonoko Sato, President and CEO of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, to talk a little bit more about the state perspective. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nonoko Sato. I'm the president and CEO of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. We are one of the largest state associations of nonprofits in our country, serving over 2,200 nonprofit organizations throughout Minnesota. I want to first thank my incredible team for their work in pulling key data and quotes that I will be sharing with you today. And we're also very proud to be in a network of many other state associations of nonprofits who are all working tirelessly to protect and advocate on behalf of your nonprofits. This is just to point out that our network is strong and that we are communicating in real time around the needs of our communities, and our network is generous in sharing our resources. Please support your capacity building organizations as donors, as joining as members, responding to our surveys and action alerts, and simply by being connected. And I also want to thank the National Council of Nonprofits for this opportunity to present to you all about what we are hearing directly from nonprofits in our state. And we're also so grateful for your leadership and your work in defending our sector so that we can focus on our missions and ultimately the communities we serve towards a thriving and just and equitable world. So first, a little bit about nonprofits. Nonprofits contribute so much to our economy. According to the independent sector, nationally, nonprofits are the third largest employer by industry and contribute 5.2% of the gross domestic product. In Minnesota alone, we have almost 9,000 financially active nonprofits. We employ 370,000 people and generate $100 billion to the state economy every year. And yet there's a misconception about nonprofits. According to Lilly School of Philanthropy, only 5% of the public think that they have been served by nonprofits in the past year. And yet nonprofits are not just homeless shelters or food banks. We touch lives of all people every day through our childcare and preschool programs, art museums and theaters, to hospitals and clinics, among other critical services. Nonprofits are also vital partners to government agencies. Federal funding accounts for at least 25% of all direct nonprofit revenue nationally, and nearly 36% of Minnesota's state budget, a majority of which is regranted to nonprofits providing essential services. Overall, 1/5 of state and local government revenues come from federal funding. And because nonprofit organizations deeply understand their communities and needs and can be nimble than the government, they fill gaps in services and supports that the governments cannot. Nonprofits are especially important for rural communities and providing health access and early childhood programming. Nonprofits create the conditions for strong communities and for businesses to flourish. And federal grants to nonprofits are not a handout. The government contracts with nonprofits and call on us to utilize our expertise and relationships to deliver key services on behalf of the state and federal governments. Without our sector, our government would have to at least double in size and invest significant resources to maintain service delivery at the same level. Or the alternative is that services are no longer provided, harming our most vulnerable communities. So let's talk a little bit about the impact of the executive orders and threats of the federal funding freeze on our sector. It has certainly been exhausting for nonprofit professionals who are already dealing with burnout, increasing demand for services, stagnant funding, and workforce issues to track the constantly shifting federal landscape, leading to uncertainty, fear, and concern. We have heard of groups that support communities specifically being targeted, immigrants, refugees, LGBTQ folks, who feel the need to meet and share resources under the radar for fear of backlash and lost funding. And as part of risk management, organizations are considering taking down preemptive DEI language, even if they don't receive federal funding. I'll touch on this point in a bit, but I do want to recognize that having an option to take down what was probably a core value a year ago is a position of privilege, as many social justice organizations simply have no choice. We also heard from organizations that are noticing that there are fewer people from targeted communities seeking services when many safe places are no longer feeling safe. And I've also talked to parents, and even my own children who are wondering why they are not seeing their immigrant or undocumented friends at school anymore. And let me tell you, it's a heartbreaking conversation to have with a young child. Nonprofits receiving federal grants are struggling to understand whether they will receive the contractually agreed dollars or reimbursements for money already spent, as they already operate on a very thin margin. This, of course, impacts payroll, contracts, pass-through grants, among other key expenses to operate critical programming. Medical centers and Head Start programs, U.S. aid organizations are having to close their doors for a day or even longer, or indefinitely, when they're not able to pay staff for work that needs to get done. And not at all to diminish the devastating humanitarian impact of cutting funding for U.S. aid, it also impacts Minnesota businesses who have pre-existing contracts to sell important commodities to the government agencies. $500 million worth of food currently is at risk of spoilage in transit or at warehouses in the U.S. meant for food insecure regions around the world. I've also talked to many nonprofits who are desperate to find alternative forms of funding, hoping to work with their foundations to offset the difference in the money they may or will not receive from the federal government. A few years ago, MCN worked with the Nonprofit Quarterly to create an illustrated nonprofit economy report, which shows that federal funding accounts for $491 billion directly to nonprofits, compared to $44 billion from foundations. In Minnesota, we have some exceptional philanthropy leaders who are rallying to try to meet the needs of the moment. And it is also really important for nonprofits to understand that philanthropy alone cannot make up the difference. And I do have some thoughts on what philanthropy can do a little bit further down. And as traditionally marginalized communities already face disparities in everything from wealth building, educational attainment, housing, food, healthcare access, we expect additional stress on nonprofits who serve them as funding to safety net programs such as Medicaid, nutrition benefits like SNAP and school meals, and cash benefits to seniors and people with severe disabilities, including children, and our most vulnerable people are impacted. Rural nonprofits are especially struggling with limited access to public infrastructure, ability to retain and attract staff and volunteers, and disproportionate amount of funding they receive compared to larger metro areas. 45% of Minnesota population live outside of the Twin Cities, but only 9% of foundation funding and only 3% of federal grant funding goes into these areas. And nationally, the statistics are very similar. While critical service providers shutting their doors can be devastating anywhere, in rural areas, a nonprofit closing their door may mean that the communities will have to find another org that may be miles away, putting more demands on the other nonprofit, and that's assuming that they have similar programming. We've received feedback from about 114 nonprofits in our survey across Minnesota with real-life examples of funding impact or uncertainty. Stories that range from seeing an increase in the number of first-time clients a food shelf is seeing. One organization said 60% of their current clients are first-time. Inability to operate the only domestic violence shelter in their rural region. Potential long-term consequences resulting from the inability to address issues like truancy and substance abuse. Unable to provide medically tailored meals and provide care for people living with dementia. Pullback on technical assistance offered to small business entrepreneurs, in addition to layoffs and cutbacks of critical programs. So I'm going to leave you with a few recommendations. I'm going to first start with philanthropy partners. I'm a bit of a broken record on this, but please continue to give general operating dollars, multi-year grants, and support capacity building for nonprofits. We know it's not as sexy as brand new programming or increasing the number of people served, but it is so important, especially as other crucial funding sources are being disrupted or cut. Give committed grants early. Release restrictions on existing restricted funds. Eliminate or simplify your administrative asks of nonprofits. Don't require a final report. Accept a nonprofit's grant application written for another funder. Simply simplify your forms. According to Grant Advisor, 20 to 30% of nonprofits' time is wasted on administrative tasks related to grant writing and reporting. Give 0% loan to nonprofits to fill the gap if the federal grants are being delayed, and consider it a grant if the funding is completely cut. Listen to what nonprofits are saying and what they need and respond accordingly. Rely on network aggregators for information like your state associations, and don't contribute to survey fatigue and ask more from your grantees when you can leverage existing networks and information. Don't generalize, assume needs, and preemptively restrict funding for things that you think nonprofits need. All of our needs are different, and I would guess that most of us would say flexible spending is what we really need right now. And help us spread accurate information that have been vetted by trusted resources like the National Council of Nonprofits. There are already so much fear and uncertainty, and we want to ensure that our nonprofits are informed and supported. And last but not least, advocate with us. Call your representatives as your champions, partners, and as citizens. And then to our nonprofits. I was wondering if somebody on the National Council of Nonprofits team can actually show the slide with a QR code, if possible, while I'm speaking. I'm going to start with advocacy. Share your stories. My last organization, I didn't know that nonprofits are able to lobby, and I never did. And even if you don't understand the complexity of lobbying, I want you to know that educating legislators about your work and the impact is not considered lobbying. Share your work, a story or two of the impact on your community, and especially about any government contracts at any level to support the work. Look up your representatives, write a script, and ask for specific action and follow-up. Organizing works. Organizing is why the federal funding freeze was impeded. Reminder that our elected officials work for us. We know that there are other resources out there, but if not, MCN has a resource information on demystifying the process of connecting with legislators, and this resource will be shared as part of the slide deck. Get your organization in order. These are things that you should be doing anyways. Also through this QR code, we are sharing a lot of resources that we are collecting. If you know of any more, please share them with us. And also with our state association friends, feel free to pull from ours as well. Again, every organization is different, and only you can determine how to prioritize these. So these are just recommendations, and how you decide to prioritize them will be up to you. First, make sure that you have the right board to support you and that they understand their basic fiduciary responsibilities. Ensure that you are compliant with federal and state laws and regulations. Conduct some scenario planning and financial forecasting, creating a cash flow document, discussing strategic use of your reserves if you have them, exploring lines of credit, talk to your funders for early access to committed grants. Create or update internal policies from succession planning, hiring practices to even sunsetting. Know your rights, especially if you work with immigrant, refugee, and people who are undocumented. It works. Clearly label within your space what is public and private, educate your staff, boards, and community about knowing their rights. There are really great resources by communities made by nonprofits. Protect your data, check your cybersecurity, and if you rely on federal data that are being removed, American Community Survey microdata is available at ipums.org. And then give yourself grace. I know you're all questioning, should I scrub this DEI language? Again, I will mention that it's a place of privilege. And if you are true to this work, you know that the work will continue regardless of what is written on your publicly facing webpage. And the reminder that DEI is not just about race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation. Equity work simply means that everybody has what they need to thrive. Some may need more support than others. Diversity is a fact between groups of 2 people or more. It includes perspectives, experiences, professional and personal backgrounds, neurodivergence and physical disabilities, and even eye color and what hand is your dominant hand. Scrubbing language does not mean that we are exempt from supporting all people. We need to stop operating in a zero-sum game and lead from a place of abundance. And lastly, take a breath. Take care of yourself. Please Google Jennifer Walter, who's a sociologist, and how to deal with overwhelm. This is a marathon. Pick and focus on few priorities at a time. Find trusted resources like the National Council of Nonprofits, aggregators, actual experts, and state associations. And if you don't have a state association, contact one in your neighboring state. Find your community and networks within your issue area and practice going slow. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nonoko. As someone who is left-handed, I always often forget that it counts as diversity in some
That's
ways or another. but I will now turn it over to Jessica Morton, Senior Counsel at Democracy Forward, to talk a little bit about what's been happening these last few days. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you, Jessica. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Morton. I'm a lawyer at Democracy Forward Foundation, and we have the privilege of representing the National Council of Nonprofits and our lawsuit against the OMB in federal court in DC. Trinity, would you mind putting up the slide of the timeline? While she does that, I'll start with some disclaimers that I'm afraid lawyers are required to give, which is first that I'm not in a position to provide individual legal advice about any of your situations. I'm really here just to provide publicly available information in my capacity as a lawyer only for the National Council of Nonprofits itself. So I'll be sharing at a pretty high level what is going on, hoping to provide some useful information about the current status. As Tiffany said earlier, I'm sure that you are all too aware. On January 27th, it became public that the Office of Management and Budget had issued a memo directing all agencies to stop immediately the disbursement of all open grant funds by 5 p.m. the following day. My team, representing the National Council of Nonprofits and several other organizations, rushed into court in DC, and we, the very next morning, filed a complaint explaining why this action violated the Administrative Procedure Act. It does this in 3 ways. So the Administrative Procedure Act, I apologize for being a little bit wonky, is a statute that governs how agency decisions can get made. And agencies have to follow the law just like you and I do. And the Administrative Procedure Act keeps them on that path. So under the APA, we brought 3 claims. First, we argued that the memo was arbitrary and capricious, which is the lawyerly way of saying it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't hold together. It's illogical to require this pause in funding, or this alleged pause in funding that had no end date given on no notice with no time for nonprofits to prepare for no good reason whatsoever. Second, we argue that OMB simply didn't have the statutory authority to issue that pause. And third, we argue that the funding freeze. And third, we argue that the funding freeze violated the First Amendment of the Constitution because it was chilling free speech about certain topics by suggesting that speech and expression of nonprofits on issues like environmental justice and DEI and others would result in funds being frozen further. So we brought these claims into court, and on that same day, Tuesday the 28th, right before things were supposed to go into effect, the court issued an administrative stay. An administrative stay is a very, very short temporary pause in proceedings that allows the court just more time to evaluate the arguments because we had filed it so soon before the deadline because of the rush that OMB created. And so that was a very short pause to keep the status quo while the parties were able to present fuller arguments to the court. The following day, on the 29th, the Office of Management and Budget purported to rescind that memo that we had sued over. But then the White House press secretary shortly thereafter tweeted that it was not, in fact, a rescission of the funding freeze, just the piece of paper it was written on. So the court case continued as a result of this, and it has been our position that the funding freeze was not truly rescinded, as the press secretary's comments reflected. And so we're in court this past Monday arguing for a temporary restraining order. A temporary restraining order is similar to this day in effect, but of slightly longer duration, and the court has to conduct a more formal legal analysis. And the temporary restraining order, it lasts for 14 days or more if extended, but it's supposed to be also a short halt in the status quo while proceedings can come further. So the court did grant our temporary restraining order and ordered that OMB had to cease implementing the funding freeze in any form and not re-implement it, and also direct the agencies to restore the funding that it had frozen. So that happened on Monday. We understand that some folks have already seen their funding come through, which is wonderful to hear. We know that there are some who are still waiting, And there are also some additional complexities in some particular buckets. I know we've been hearing from some questions that were submitted before this from folks who maybe have funds that are appropriated under the Inflation Reduction Act or Infrastructure Act. And situations like that may have additional complexities. And so I'm afraid, sorry that I'm not able to speak to all of these for you, but just know that we are certainly aware of those issues. The next step in our case is that while the temporary restraining order remains in place, we're going to work towards motion for preliminary injunction. So the temporary restraining order is always intended to be of quite short duration. A preliminary injunction order is similar in kind, and the legal analysis is similar. But the difference is that for a grant of preliminary injunction, that lasts for the entire duration of the case until a final judgment. And so it sort of slows down the emergency proceedings we've been having and will, if it's granted, result in the status quo for the duration of the case. So the next step in our case is that the motion for preliminary injunction is due on February 11th, and the temporary restraining order is still in place in that meantime. The other thing I wanted to flag here is just to really, thank all the nonprofits that shared their stories. This has been incredibly wonderful for me to be able to convey those stories to the court. And it's really a privilege to be able to, move beyond the very wonky comments I was making just now and understand and explain to other people how many people this is affecting in the real world. And so please don't think that any of that is getting lost amid the lawyerly jargon, because that really is the heart of the case. I'll turn it back to you, Jessica.
Thanks. And also appreciate just making so many complex terms just make sense for a lot of people that know, well, what exactly is the real world effect of this? So I'm going to invite folks to turn their cameras on for the Q&A section if you can. And again, we received nearly 20,000 registrations, either for live attendance or to receive the recording. So we read as many questions as we could. We read most of the questions and we incorporate this into a presentation one way or another. So we recognize that a lot of questions have already been answered and some may not be answered just given the nature of the evolving situation. So I'll start with one that I think Jessica can still answer, which is just given everything that is happening, what are some things that nonprofits can do to, like, either in response, not necessarily challenge, but just in response to everything that's happening?
Thank you. I think really the main thing is continuing to tell stories in multiple ways. So in the lawsuit that we filed, we included a number of written declarations from NCN members and others who were able to explain what effect the funding freeze had on them as an organization and the communities that they serve. And these were referenced multiple times in the temporary restraining order hearing and in the court's opinion. Because this is really an analysis in part that turns on what injury people are suffering as a result of these executive actions. And as you all know better than anyone, the injury is irreparable and it is tremendous and significant. And so it's all well and good for me to walk into court and say that, but it's so much more powerful to hear from a wide array of voices who can talk about the absolutely heartbreaking instances of potentially having to turn away people who are in desperate need of services across a variety of sectors. And so sharing that story with the NCN team, sharing that story with the media, sharing that story in your communities is so powerful, because sometimes executive actions and OMB memos can feel very far away from people's lived experiences, but everyone in America has had some interaction with a nonprofit at some point, and helping people understand the real cost of these actions is so powerful, and that's something that you can do better than anyone.
And Jessica, can I add to that too? We also got a question about, like, what can I do? Is reaching out to Congress worth the time? And I think Nonoko hit on that a little bit during her section too, which is great. But I do want to put a pin in that and say, like, you should reach out to Congress and tell your story, tell your story, your organization's story about how this is affecting you. How any of the executive orders are affecting you, how any of the memos are affecting you, how this is actually being implemented, because Congress needs to hear that as your representation. And you can also reach out to your state legislators as well and your city council. You know, all the levels of government really play into this, and they need to know what's happening in their community so that they can represent you effectively.
Thanks, Tiffany. And I guess since you're already off mic, I guess I'll just ask the next question, which is, what are the effects that these executive orders can or will have on the future of federal funding?
Yeah, Jessica, you might want to jump into this too, but there's a couple questions with that, right? So I'll touch on like what's happening in Congress right now, right? So there's a couple pieces. We are currently in a continuing resolution that goes through March 14th, which is funding the federal government as we speak. But that funding ends on March 14th. So at some point, the federal government's going to have to extend that. And all these decisions that are being made with these funding freezes and the funding streams through the executive orders and through the memos and everything that's happening, that's going to, you know, Congress is paying attention to that. They're making decisions based on that as well. But they have to make a decision on the continuing resolution by March 14th, or else the federal government will shut down. There's also this conversation about reconciliation and having a tax debate. The tax law that passed in 2017, a lot of those provisions end at the end of this year. And so both the House and Senate right now are debating on how to address that, whether to extend those provisions or not, and how to pay for that and things. And that's going to affect the budget as well going into the next year. So there's a lot of decisions that are being made in the legislative branch. But I don't know, Jessica, if you want to talk about kind of how this plays into kind of the question of separation of powers too.
Thanks, Tiffany. I think I can't delve too deeply into that right now, though, of course, as Tiffany indicated, you know, Congress does authorize spending and appropriations, and that is really in their bailiwick. And so it's important to keep that in mind. I think, you know, the other piece of that is really, you know, as to the question of how will these, you know, executive orders affect folks. I think this is really goes to the benefit of organizations like NCN and the opportunity to understand what is happening from all of you. And so I would just encourage everyone to continue being engaged and involved and sharing with the amazing resources NCN is offering, so that they can be apprised at a programmatic level and seeing what's happening across the country, more widespread of how this is really being implemented.
Thanks. And before turning it back to Diane for some closing remarks, I invite the panelists to share any last minute remarks, advice, or just any reassurance.
Any reassurance? That's a great question, Jessica. I'll just say, you know, you're not alone. We are working together as a sector. We represent the sector, and we want you to feel supported as best as you can be. And tell us your stories and tell others your stories, because that's how we know what's happening and we can share that broadly as well. So you're not alone. Please reach out to your state associations, reach out to each other, reach out to us. We want to be there to support you.
I would really echo that. It's a huge privilege for me personally and for Democracy Forward to represent NCN in this lawsuit and to get to stand alongside nonprofits. And I hope that you were aware that, you know, as there is news that is, you know, showing attacks on your mission, that there are just as many people who are supporting you and are grateful for the amazing work that you all are doing and want you to succeed in that.
Can I add as well? I don't know if I'm on camera. Okay. Yeah, so everything that all this brilliant people have said, but honestly, what I would say as individuals and as people, like, you have to find joy in your life, and nonprofits do so much to make things so beautiful for us. So go and enjoy the natural environments that the climate folks have, you know, just worked so hard to protect. Go and see a theater show. A lot of arts organizations are struggling right now. Go support museums and just absorb the joy as best as you can during this time. And obviously, again, going back to the take care of yourself and take care of each other, we're just stronger together. So again, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And thanks, Jessica, Tiffany, and Nonoko for all the information you shared. And I will now turn it back to Diane for some closing remarks.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks to you, Jessica, for facilitating. Thanks to all of our speakers. And thanks to the entire team at National Council of Nonprofits who's working so hard and well in these challenging times, all doing our very best and our very most to share information with you all to respond to this unique and uniquely challenging moment. And a reminder that this is the beginning, not the end of a conversation, and that at NCN, we are working to continue supporting your important work with an understanding that what you all need most right now are really two things. One, information, concise, accurate, up to date, and two, action, right? Advocacy, litigation, legislation, broad communications, preparation for what's to come for individual nonprofits and for the sector at large. And we're working on all of the above. So continue to check out our chart on executive orders and associated actions. We continue to regularly update it with the latest information. In the coming weeks, we'll also be sharing out FAQs and sector-specific fact sheets that break down the risks for funding investigations, and we'll share best practices for ways to prepare and respond. We're also working much more broadly on strategies related to litigation, communications, and advocacy, and we'll have more to share on that in the coming days and weeks. And in the meantime, many of you have asked us, what can you do right now? And you heard a lot of great ideas already throughout the webinar. So just to reiterate a few things that you can do today if you want to take action now. Join your state association of nonprofits. Check our website on how to do so or reach out to us. Sign up for NCN Communications. You can find the link for that on our website. Follow us on social media. You can follow me, National Council of Nonprofits, all of today's speakers. Share your stories on how you're being impacted by funding cuts with us. You can fill out an easy form that we have on our webpage. The team is checking those and reading those in real time as they come in. And then, as you heard several times, I'll be the third to say it and underscore, share those stories with your members of Congress. They need to hear about the impacts on organizations and people in their communities, and you all are the best people to tell them. So thank you again so much for joining today. Thank you for your good, important work. Please take good care of yourselves and of each other, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you so much.